Hey, this is Joe from Home Studio Corner. This is time sensitive. If you're watching this before June 15th, 2023, and you haven't registered for my free webinar, you still have time to do that. Go to homestudiocorner.com/register. I'm going to be talking about 9 home studio mistakes, ones that I've made, and hopefully help you avoid making them yourself so you can make better music without all the hassle. We're going to cover a lot of really cool stuff there, and I'll be opening up my VIP membership to new members. So if you're looking for a community, looking for your place to belong, now's your time to join. So go sign up for that webinar to find out everything. If you can't make it to the live event, again, it's June 15th, 8 p.m. Central Time. If you sign up using that link, you'll get access to the recording as well, and the doors will be open for about a week. So homestudiocorner.com/register. All right, let's dive into today's topic. So today's topic is one of those I was wrong kind of videos. Not an apology video, just I did not have all the information. And I learned something, and it's complicated, and so I want to talk about it, even though I will be the first to say I don't fully and completely understand this world, but I understand it enough to get the results I want to get, and then I kind of let the chips fall where they may. So we're going to talk about loudness, specifically Spotify, how it affects the loudness of our music. Okay. I recently did a mastering video for my VIP members called Mastering Do's and Don'ts. And I talked about several different mistakes people tend to make in mastering and a few best practices to incorporate into your mastering workflow. And I talked a little bit about loudness and how if I make my music this loud as I can make it, but then I upload it to Spotify or Apple Music, they've got a set volume that they're expecting everything to come in. And if yours is over that, they're going to turn it down. So it's a result of loudness wars. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But if it's too loud, they're just going to turn it down anyway. So there's no reason to sacrifice quality to get it as loud as possible. That's the general principle. And I also said that if your stuff is too quiet, then the system's not going to turn it up. So it won't do the reverse. If it's too loud, it turns it down, but it won't do the reverse of turning it up all the way. That was my hypothesis. Then somebody left a comment and said, actually, Spotify, if your music is below the level they want, it will raise it up to that level and use its own built-in limiter to do that so that it gets to that level of minus 14 LUFS to match with everything else on Spotify. And my first response to that in my head was that can't be true. That cannot be true. But I did some research, and as it turns out, well, I'll tell you what I discovered in that research in just a second. Before I do, we need to talk about loudness and make sure we're on the same page. So very quickly, what is loudness? So loudness is a measurement of volume, obviously. Typically, it's talking about the average level of a piece of music. And over the last few years, a standard emerged called LUFS. LUFS stands for Loudness Units Full Scale. And it's become a bit of a standard for the average loudness of your track. So the idea is the peaks in your track are going to hit a limiter, and then the average level of your track is down here. And generally speaking, the greater the distance between the peaks and the average level, the more dynamic range you have in your mix, and typically the better it sounds. You want to raise the volume of your mix to get a nice loud volume so we can hear everything well, and it sounds good in the car and everywhere else. But if we go too far in that direction, we have so many peaks hitting the limiter, and the average level is getting closer and closer to the limiter that we lose all that dynamic. So the loudest and quietest parts are so close together, it doesn't sound good. So when LUFS came along, slowly the streaming services started to implement LUFS into their system and saying, hey, if your stuff's louder than this specific level, we're going to just turn you down. Boom, loudness wars ended. Not really, but you get the idea. So generally speaking, in the early days of like putting albums on records, there was a physical limit to how loud it could be. If you made it too loud, the needle would skip. So there wasn't a loudness war, there wasn't a problem. With digital systems, we're talking about bits and bytes. We can make it literally as loud as we want, and we entered an era kind of starting in the 90s, moving into the 2000s of things just getting louder and louder and louder just because we could, because, human nature. But we realized at some point that, hey, they don't sound very good anymore. Yeah, they're loud, but they've lost all their punch. There's like distortion happening. It's just not great. So now we're easing back into, let's have it nice and loud, big and full and awesome, but not so loud that it kills the music. So what are the LUFS values that these streaming services are looking for? Well, there's a lot of them out there, obviously, but for Spotify, it's minus 14 LUFS. And for Apple Music, it's minus 16. So 0 being clipping, this is basically an average level of 14 decibels below clipping. So a dynamic range in between there. So nice and full dynamic range. You don't have to slam it, because if you do and you go way up here to like a LUFS value of minus 5, it's just going to get turned down anyway, and it's not going to sound as good as everybody else. So who was right? Well, I had to do a little bit of research because I couldn't just say that can't be true based on just my intuition. So I went over to Spotify's own page. Took me a while to find it, but on this page on Spotify's website about loudness normalization, it says a couple of very interesting things. First of all, we adjust tracks to minus 14 dB LUFS. Okay, so there, they said it, minus 14 LUFS. We normalize an entire album so that the volume from one track to the next is how it's intended, but we also adjust individual tracks if you're listening on a playlist or not listening to an entire album. That's great, super. Then it says negative gain will be applied to louder masters, so the loudness level is at minus 14, meaning if it's louder than minus 14, we're going to turn your butt down. Positive gain, this is really interesting. Check this out. Positive gain is applied to softer masters, so the loudness level is at minus 14. We consider the headroom of the track and leave 1 dB headroom for lossy encodings to preserve audio quality. That's good practice. It says, for example, check this out. If a track loudness level is at minus 20, so it's a little too quiet, and its true peak maximum is at minus 5, we only lift the track up to minus 15 or minus 16 LUFS. You see what's happening there? Because the peak is at minus 5, and they're saying we're going to set a hard ceiling at minus 1, they can only turn everything up by 4 decibels. So the peak goes from minus 5 to minus 1, and then the average, the LUFS, goes from minus 20 to minus 16, which means it's still 2 full decibels quieter than everything else. Because Spotify, I was right, is not adding any sort of limiting. It's not going to force it up to minus 14. It's just going to turn it up as much as it can without clipping. It's basically doing what we call normalization. It's taking the loudest peak and bringing it up. The one little difference is it's bringing it up to minus 1 because that's good for converters and things like that. Now, so I was right. I was also wrong. Check this out. Premium listeners can also choose volume normalization levels in the app settings to compensate for noisy and quiet environments. So here it says for a loud setting, which by the way, this looks like this. No, thank you. Here, if I turn normalize volume on, which just generally says set the same volume level for all songs and podcasts, turn that on, then it gives me this drop down for quiet, normal, and loud. Check this out. Adjust the volume for your environment. Loud may diminish audio quality. No effect on audio quality in normal or quiet. Okay? So if I switch to loud, now the things we're reading about in this article are true. The loud setting of minus 11 dB, which is 3 dB louder than minus 14, right? It says we set this level regardless of maximum true peak. So that's kind of throwing caution out the window. We apply a limiter to prevent distortion and clipping in soft dynamic tracks. The limiter's set to engage at minus 1 sample values with a 5 millisecond attack and 100 millisecond decay time. So it is literally doing exactly what my friend said in the comment. It's adding a limiter, and I have no control over what that's going to do to the sound. It's just taking my thing and going and increasing it and adding its own limiter on top of the limiter I already have. For normal and quiet, it's just adjusting volume. It's not affecting the sound quality at all because it's not applying any processing. It's literally just taking where it is and lowering it down, right? So what do we do with this information? By the way, I know that Apple's LUFS setting is minus 16. I couldn't find anything on their site to indicate if they do any limiting, but based on kind of a bunch of different resources I looked into, I don't think Apple does anything to add any limiting to the sound. It just plays it. It turns it down if it's too loud, and otherwise it just plays it, but it's not going to change and alter the sound. So does that mean Spotify's doing something wrong? What's the takeaway? First of all, no, because you have the option to turn it on and off, so it's your choice. If I'm mowing the yard and I'm listening to a quieter album and I want it to just be louder so I can hear it, that loudness setting makes a lot of sense. Or perhaps someone likes the sound of it being squished a little bit more. The fact that we have the option is cool. And it even tells you in the settings, this will degrade the audio most likely because we're adding another 3 dB essentially of gain reduction. It's probably going to make things sound a little crunchy. But there is that option. So there's two ways to think about this. The first is kind of where I used to be of just master it, kind of quiet, and you're good to go. Because if you go too loud, it's going to turn it down anyway. The problem with that is if I master, let's say, at -11, which is cooking, right? -10, -11, nice and loud. Even if the person flicks up to the loud version in Spotify, they're going to hear the exact same master that I did because they're not going to have to turn it up because it's already at -11. However, if they're listening at normal, it's just going to take my -11 and turn it down to -14, and it's going to sound exactly the same. If they go quiet, it's going to turn it down, sound exactly the same. Now, does that mean we should all master at -11? I don't think so. No, I still aim for around -14, generally speaking. But I looked at my latest album with Stare Down, and I was actually getting up closer to 11 because they were just big rockin' songs, and it just sounded cool to push them a little hotter than maybe I normally would. And that's the ultimate takeaway from all of this is the exact measurement of your loudness. It's an important data point, but it's not the most important one, right? If it is a terrible sounding mix and master, doesn't matter what the loudness is, it's not going to be pleasant to listen to. If it's a wonderful mix and then you go crazy with your mastering, you're going to undo a lot of that good work you did in the mix. But if it all sounds good at every stage and you're careful and thoughtful and you don't overdo your processing, if it's a little extra loud than maybe you thought it should be, but it sounds amazing to you, wonderful. That's great. I think if anything, it's just a good reminder that all this loudness stuff and all the good work of people like Ian Shepherd been talking about dynamic range day and loudness wars for well over a decade, it's made a real impact and it's made music better as a result, because now we're not having to just cram as much loudness into it as possible because now there's not as much of a payoff for doing that. All right, so I understand that stuff like this, I don't love making videos like this because it's not as fun as, setting up a guitar and like making music, but this stuff is important. Some of what we do falls under the category of science, right? It's a lot of art, but there's some science there, right? We deal with audio waves and acoustics and things like measuring loudness with like an actual loudness measurement device, right? These are scientific tools. It's important to know them at least a little bit so that we can make educated choices about what we do with our music. However, even though I have a degree in audio, this stuff still kind of confuses me sometimes. And it's nice to have a community of people that you can lean into when you're stuck, when you're not sure what to do next, when you're hearing differing pieces of advice and you're just trying to make sense of things. You don't have to do it alone. My VIP members have become this community of people who are learning and improving and building a body of work, but they're not having to do it in a vacuum. If you want to find out more about VIP and come to my free training on June 15th at 8 p.m. Central, this is the year 2023, go to homestudiocorner.com/register. That gets you into the live event and it gets you access to the replay as well. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.